Today we're going to be talking about one component of the cardiovascular system, the blood. So blood is made up of many different elements, actually. We're very familiar with red blood cells because basically that's what gives blood its color. But within blood, we also have white blood cells, platelets, and other elements like nutrients, waste products, ions, water, and so forth. So what we're looking at here in this picture is a red blood cell, which many people call an RBC, a white blood cell, or WBC, and over here this is a platelet. The platelet is just a fragment of membrane. It's not even a real cell. There's no nucleus, there's no really organelles in there. It's a fragment that helps form a blood clot after someone has been cut. So let's first start with just briefly, what does the cardiovascular system do? It links all the organ systems in the body. It helps absorb nutrients from the food in the digestive system. It helps exchange gas in the respiratory system, exchange gases like oxygen and CO2. It helps us get rid of waste products through the urinary system and the kidneys. The cardiovascular system is basically a big conduit through which nutrients and waste products travel around in the body. So let's first start with blood and the functions of blood. Blood is basically a connective tissue fluid, all right, and it's connective because it connects many different organ systems. Lots of functions here. It distributes nutrients, like we said, oxygen. In addition to that, it distributes hormones. It carries metabolic waste to the kidneys for excretion. The kidneys excrete things. Transports specialized cells, the immune system cells, white blood cells, to defend tissues against infection and defend tissues against disease. It helps our bodies regulate pH. The pH of our bloodstream and the pH of our body is very important for maintaining homeostasis. Blood also helps us maintain our temperature. If we are too hot, blood will rush to the blood vessels in your skin, like in your cheeks and in your arms, and it helps us cool off. It helps prevent fluid loss and at damaged blood vessels by clotting. And when we say damaged blood vessels, it can be something as simple as a paper cut or as severe as a major wound that causes hemorrhaging. So blood will start clotting to block the flow of blood, of fluid, out of the body. All of these activities are essential to maintain homeostasis. If these activities aren't maintained, the organism will die, potentially even within a matter of minutes. So for example, if there's massive fluid loss, if there's massive hemorrhaging through a cut, a big injury, an individual can actually die within minutes because of blood loss. So this picture has a lot of information in it, a whole lot of information in it. We're going to start at the simple end and move our way to the more complicated elements. So blood itself, they're just showing a picture right here of a syringe removing blood from an individual. Blood can be broken down into two components, all right? Number one, the plasma or the liquid element, and number two, the formed or, not liquid, the cellular components. Let's start with plasma for a minute. Plasma is made up of lots and lots of water, obviously, but there's a lot of plasma proteins in there called globulins. There are other solutes. Solutes will be things like, salts, organic waste, amino acids, fats. And then we have water. Most of your blood is made up of water and the other stuff, other solutes. So the plasma proteins consist of the albumins. The albumins are the most common, and they help maintain what we call osmotic pressure. It helps keep water in the blood. You'll learn a lot about that in physiology. You'll also find transport lipids, steroid hormones. These all make up a group called the albumins. You have the globulins, about 35%. These are basically they're basically proteins that are involved in an immune response. If you're sick, your globulin content can go up. It also includes some lipids, hormones, and transport ions. Fibrinogen, this is an essential component of blood clotting. Fibrinogen, when it hits oxygen, becomes fibrin. And that is a huge part of a blood clot. It's like having a liquid net that when it hits oxygen, puffs up into a giant net to catch red blood cells, white blood cells, and form a clot. All right, you'll hear about that in physiology. And then we have other regulatory proteins, hormones, enzymes, and so forth. As far as the other solutes, we have our electrolytes, mostly salts, things like potassium, calcium, sodium, and so forth. There's also, sometimes, chloride and stuff like that. These are just basically items that are around for regular cellular functioning. We have organic nutrients, which does include ATP, okay? Sometimes ATP will be out there. Growth hormones, cholesterol, triglycerides, fats, carbohydrates, amino acids, larger proteins, and so forth. And then we have organic waste in the form of urea, bilirubin, ammonium, uric acid, creatine, and so forth. So all of these compounds are going to be included in plasma, the liquid component, because they can all be dissolved in water. The formed elements are what we're going to spend a little bit more time on in this lecture. We're going to first talk, well, not first, but we will be talking about platelets. Remember, platelets are just cellular fragments. We call them cell fragments. Or you can call them membrane fragments as well. We have white blood cells, which consist of the neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. Remember, melanocyte is not a white blood cell. That is a pigment cell. We'll talk about how these are formed and what they do in a little bit. And then we have our red blood cells, which are called erythrocytes, which transport oxygen. So the major blood components, this is the list from your book in this figure. I didn't blow it up anymore because you wouldn't be able to see it, but I included it here so that you could look at the component in the blood, the subcomponent and percent of that, type, where you're going to find each of these things, site of production, very important actually. A lot of plasma is made in the liver, a lot of the plasma proteins, the albumins, and then their major functions. So here's your plasma and your form elements, the leukocytes and the platelets and the erythrocytes. So I think this is really funny because this line should have been here because erythrocytes are a part of the formed elements. This should not be here like this. Hope they fix that in the next edition of the book. So this is also in your book, and this is just showing you an example of blood composition. In normal blood, you're going to have a certain percentage. In males and females, it's slightly different, but you'll have a certain percentage of a blood sample that's going to be made of red blood cells. We call that the hematocrit. Hemo or hemato, it means, like red blood cell. We have something called the buffy coat here, this little white region, or kind of like lighter region. That buffy coat is made up of white blood cells and platelets, and if somebody's very sick, that buffy coat will be definitely thicker. And so in physiology, we used to do a hematocrit measurement, and in students who had a cold or the flu, you could see that buffy coat really, really intensely. And then we have plasma here, which is kind of a straw-colored liquid. And that's your water, your proteins, hormones, waste products, and so forth. In a normal person, in women, between 37% and 47% of the total volume, okay? So that would be, let me erase that. That didn't look so good. That would be this entire column here. This is the total volume. Between 37 and 47% would be made up of red blood cells. In a man, that's going to be between 42 and 52%. So for a man, almost half of his blood is made up of red blood cells. In somebody with anemia is a decreased or depressed percentage of red blood cells. So you have the same column here, right? But the red blood cell component is much lower than in the regular normal blood. In polycythemia, you have the opposite, where you have most of the blood taken up by red blood cells. This isn't good because in polycythemia, red blood cells tend to be sticky and they can cause blood clots. So that's not a good thing, polycythemia. So again, just to write it out, plasma is the liquid matrix of blood. It contains lots of dissolved ions, proteins, fats, hormones, and so forth. The formed elements are your blood cells, red blood cells, which transport oxygen, and to a lesser degree, carbon dioxide. However, they can transport carbon dioxide via hemoglobin. White blood cells, which are a part of our immune system, which defend us against pathogens, and platelets, which are small little chunks of membrane that they can contain enzymes, and they do contain enzymes. And those enzymes are also important for blood clotting. So I just blew this up so you could get a closer look at what's going on in the plasma from that first slide. Protein solutes. Serum, interestingly, is plasma without the clotting factors or the fibrogen present. So you can actually remove the fibrogen and have serum, which is very, very high in antibodies. And right now, in 2020, we know that one of the treatments for COVID-19, right, is antibody or serum therapy. And what they do is they take serum from somebody, a COVID-19 plus serum. And what this is it's originally a blood sample taken by an individual that's had COVID-19 and survived. If you've had COVID-19 and you've survived, your blood is going to contain antibodies that recognize COVID-19. And so this is just kind of a cartoon to show an antibody molecule with two sites to recognize COVID-19. So if this antibody sees a COVID-19 virus, it'll stick to it and target it for destruction. You're going to talk about that in physiology, how that system works. But this antibody is going to be in high concentration in someone who was COVID-19 positive. And so what they do is they collect blood samples from people who had COVID-19. They produce serum from it by the removal of the fibrogen, and then they can take that serum and give it to other people who have COVID-19 because it's like delivering antibodies directly to their bloodstream to help fight the COVID-19 infection. So if we could just purify just this and inject it into people, that would be a powerful, powerful therapeutic. There you go, Shark Tank idea. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about plasma. Plasma is actually, when it leaks out of the blood vessels, it becomes interstitial fluid. So plasma, the ion concentrations in plasma are really close to what you're going to find in the interstitial fluid between the cells. The big difference is going to be in the amount of oxygen and CO2 that you find in plasma versus interstitial fluid. Because plasma is floating around in the bloodstream, that means that plasma is exposed to the lungs pretty often. And so that brings more oxygen into plasma. On the other hand, interstitial fluid is the fluid, the salty liquid surrounding cells outside of the blood vessels, right? So you have oxygen that can diffuse over into the tissues, but the tissues themselves have more CO2 in it. So interstitial fluid, IF, has more CO2, whereas plasma has more oxygen. Plasma itself has lots of dissolved proteins. Interstitial fluid doesn't, because cells will absorb those proteins and use them. A large size of plasma proteins, the large size of the plasma proteins, those albumins, prevents other proteins from escaping through capillaries. You'll learn, and actually water too. You will learn a lot about that in physiology. Now let's move on to the formed elements or the cellular elements of blood. The two major components of formed elements are the red blood cells and the white blood cells, the erythrocytes and the leukocytes. Okay, white blood cells are leukocytes. There are two major classes of white blood cells, the granular and the agranular. And what this is it's a description of how grainy they look when you put them on a microscope slide and stain them with a dye. Blood also contains platelets that function in clotting. We'll look at that as well. So here's just a real quick picture that you saw before, blown up. Platelets look like these little fragments. Can you guess which ones are going to be the granulocytes versus the agranulocytes? These ones look grainy in the cytoplasm. These ones don't, right? The lymphocytes and the monocytes. Now, one of the things that confused me a whole lot when I was in school was lymphocyte, leukocyte, lymphocyte, leukocyte. A lymphocyte, lympho, is a part of the leukocytes. Leukocyte is a white blood cell. A lymphocyte is a subclass of a leukocyte. So leuk comes before lymph. And then you have the erythrocytes down here. All right, so let's start with those erythrocytes, or RBCs, red blood cells. Now, if you look at a red blood cell, you'll notice that they look like little discs that have these little concavities. Interestingly, in mammals, erythrocytes shed their nuclei. In other words, a red blood cell does not have a nucleus. And what's cool about that is it allows the red blood cell to transport oxygen much more efficiently through the bloodstream. So the absence of that nucleus and actually other cytoplasmic organelles limits the lifespan to about 120 days. So there aren't a whole lot of, actually there aren't any mitochondria in red blood cells, and there's no nucleus. So that means that they can kind of just live on glycolysis, for those of you who've taken physiology or micro. But they don't really have to do a whole lot of work. It's not like they're contracting or anything. They just have to float around. Oxygen attaches to them and releases on its own. So red blood cells just float around carrying hemoglobin. But that's the beauty of not having a nucleus or a bunch of mitochondria, is you have more space for the hemoglobin. So erythropoiesis is the process by which red blood cells are produced, and that happens in red bone marrow. We've talked about that before. Our bodies make about 3 million red blood cells each second, because we lose about 3 million red blood cells each second. So we're constantly recreating that which is being lost. So as they're being created and as they enter circulation, red blood cells will shed their nucleus, and that's when they take on that concave shape and they're able to transport oxygen more efficiently. I talked briefly about the hematocrit. It's a measure of the percent of blood that's made up of red blood cells. It differs between men and women. It's just the way it is. The average for men is 42. The average for women is 40%. And anything lower than 37% in either is indicative of anemia. And so here you go. There's about 260 million red blood cells in a single drop of blood. And this is a picture in your book of the shape of red blood cells. This is a graphic showing you what hemoglobin looks like. So I love this. Here's a square, and within the square is this sort of. Hemoglobin is actually a pretty big molecule. It's made up of 4 heme chains. There are 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. And each one of these chains in the middle has a heme group. This heme group in the center has a ferrous ion in it. Fe, remember, equals iron. So basically, iron is converted into a hemoglobin so that each Fe, or each iron, can carry 1 oxygen. So each molecule of hemoglobin carries 1, 2, 3, 4 oxygen molecules, which equals 8 individual oxygens. Okay, because remember this O2, it's an oxygen double bound to an oxygen. And this is, again, another picture just from your book, so you can see the arrangement of alpha and beta chains and the heme groups. Now let's move on to, the white blood cells. White blood cells, they do have nuclei, and they function, FXN means function, in immunity. We have the granulocytes, or the granular lymphocytes. Remember, all white blood cells are leukocytes, but the lymphocytes are right here. You know what? I think I keep bumping my little clicker here. The agranulocytes do not have cytoplasmic granules. So the granulocytes, made in red bone marrow, they have grains or granules in the cytoplasm when you stain them and look at the microscope. And these consist of the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Neutrophil, eosinophil, and basophil. These are your granulocytes. Which means these are your agranulocytes. And you just put an A in front of it, right? These guys are made up of monocytes and lymphocytes. They are not I should say, in addition to being made in the red bone marrow, they're also made in other lymphatic tissues like the thymus, especially the thymus actually in children, and in the spleen. A differential white blood cell count is how much of each white blood cell do you have in your blood. And this is very indicative of health or wellness. A normal number would be between 5 and 10,000 white blood cells per mil of blood. If you have over 10,000 white blood cells in your blood, odds are you have some sort of illness that your body is trying to fight. All right, so neutrophils. 60 to 70% of white blood cells are made up of neutrophils. Remember, these are granulocytes. They're phagocytic, so they can go around and consume stuff in your bloodstream. If a bacteria gets in there, they can jump on them and eat them. Interestingly, they have what we call lobular nuclei. So you can see that this nucleus has like these little lumps and lobes. So this is called a lobular nucleus. And they have these fine cytoplasmic granules. They look grainy. Eosinophils, are also phagocytic. They only make up 2 to 4% of white blood cells. Neutrophils are 60 to 70%. These are the most common when you see them in a blood slide. The eosinophils are a lot less common. They also have lobular nuclei, although neutrophils only have 2 lobes. In addition to that, they have these red grains. Now, interestingly, a neutrophil and an eosinophil, and even the basophils, they're both stained with a purple and a red stain. Only the eosinophils pick up the red stain very well. In fact, the stain is called eosin, so that's why they're called eosinophils. You're going to see a whole lot of eosinophils in allergic reaction and in defending an individual against parasites. So in helminths or worms, in an animal or even in a human. If somebody has like worms, intestinal worms, you'll find some eosinophils, a lot more of them in their bloodstream. You'll also find eosinophils present at a higher number in the lungs in asthmatics. Asthmatic, or they call it eosinophilic asthma, is a big problem because what the eosinophils do is they release compounds that actually bring on the allergic reaction, the asthmatic reaction. So eosinophilic asthma has to be controlled by interrupting the eosinophils. And the last are the granulocytes, the basophils. These are pretty uncommon. They're 0.5 to 1% of all white blood cells in the blood. They release histamine, and they are very involved in inflammation. They release histamine in response to all kinds of crazy stuff. Sometimes tissue injuries, sometimes something that you're allergic to. Sometimes they're just hyperactive. So basophilic immune response can also contribute to conditions like lupus and other autoimmune diseases. And these guys have blue staining granules. So here's another picture of the granular leukocytes, the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Now let's talk about the agranulocytes, which includes our lymphocytes. So remember, leuk comes before lymph. The monocytes are, again, phagocytic. They have a kidney bean-shaped nucleus. It's kind of lobular, but this looks more like a kidney bean. And these guys wander around underneath your skin. They'll leave the bloodstream. They can wander around inside your lungs. They wander around looking for invaders like bacteria or virus particles, and they try to phagocytize them to help get rid of the infection. Lymphocytes, on the other hand, 20 to 25% of our white blood cells are simple round nuclei. These are the ones that can turn into T cells or B cells. They start out with a big purple nucleus, which almost fills the entire cell. You always know this is a lymphocyte because the nucleus is almost as big as the whole cell. T lymphocytes are going to attack damaged or viral infected cells. So basically what happens is the B cells go and tag the infected cell, and then the lymphocyte, the T lymphocyte, comes along and kills that cell. Basically, it's kind of cool because a B cell will go around almost like with sticky notes. That's the way I think about it. They stamp the infected cell, and the T cell is always scanning around looking for that tag, for that stamp. And if it sees a cell with that stamp, it just comes and literally dumps enzymes on that cell to kill it. It's pretty impressive. B lymphocytes are obviously the other type of lymphocyte. plasma cells, which make antibody proteins that recognize invaders and stuff. You are going to hear about that in great detail in physiology. They produce antibodies, and again, they tag the infected cells. So the B lymphocytes tell the T lymphocytes who to kill. Basically, the T lymphocytes are like assassins. It's kind of the way I've always looked at it. Now, platelets and thrombocytes are also produced in the red bone marrow. Platelets are fragments of what we call megakaryocytes. I'll show you where those guys fall in the blood family, the blood cell family in a little bit. Cell membranes, just with a piece of cytoplasm, no nucleus, no organelles. They don't last very long, 10 to 12 days. You know, there are a lot of platelets in blood so that you can have a blood clot form if you get cut. And basically, the big upshot is that platelets are around, or thrombocytes, they're also called thrombocytes, they're around for blood clotting or clumping. Okay, clumping together will form a scab from the original platelet plug. The platelet plug is the original kind of glossy, gloopy looking item, which dries out and becomes a scab. And the thrombocyte is what we call an archaic name. It was used before we knew what platelets were. So that is the end of our lecture today. Hope you enjoyed blood. We will continue on with more of the cardiovascular system next.